She finished her doctorate degree of religious studies in School of Oriental and African Studies in United. Her expertise is gender and Buddhism, sociology of religion, and contemporary Buddhist culture. Without further ado, please welcome Professor Cheng.
Thank you, Sharina, for the nice introduction. I see many familiar names here, so I guess there are many of our students present here. Right, so a little bit introducing of myself as I was told. My name is Wei-Yi, of course, and I'm so happy to be here today. I have studied in UK, as you can tell, and also I have studied in Canada. Primarily, my study focusing on contemporary Buddhism, especially on the subject of women in Buddhism. But recently, I noticed that I have shift my studies more from gender to what we call transnational Buddhism. I find it so fascinating to see there are diverse ethnic migrant groups in Taiwan, and they bring in so many interesting and non-Chinese Buddhist practice and beliefs. So that is my focusing on my current studies, which is more on transnational Buddhism rather than what I had done previously on gender in Buddhism. So today I'm not so much to share a talk or even a speech or even a lecture, but just to talk about something. But rather I'll prefer to talk. Or today I'm going to share my experience of talking. I'm sorry. Can you hear me? I'm being told that there's no voice from my here. Okay, I hope you can hear me now. Sorry. My talk today is not so much a formal lecture, but more about sharing my thought and experience of teaching this course called Contemporary Buddhism. This is one of the courses I taught in our MA program in the English section. So in our department, we have both Chinese and English MA program, and this is one of my favorite course in the English section, the English program. And today I'm just going to share some of my thoughts about the studies of contemporary Buddhism and what I have learned from interacting with our students. In my course, we certainly cover a lot of issues that concern the current state of Buddhism, such we will talk about environmentalism, animal rights, gender and sexuality, business, migration, or a little bit about psychology, especially on the mindfulness. And certainly there is so much subject, so many more issues that I could not have touched on in my class, such as Buddhist and nationalism, with what happens in some of the South and Southeast Asia Buddhist countries. There has been a growing interest in about Buddhism and violence, and that's one of a very hot topic, but unfortunately, I normally wouldn't have the time to touch it on in my course. And so certainly there is the questions about digital Buddhism or robot technology of this kind of issues. That is very interesting and very present, but I have not been able to touch it on. And of course, there's also children and family issues. I have not been able to talk about this issue about family, householder, and and children in our contemporary Buddhism course, mainly because there hasn't been enough research into this subject that would give me enough reading materials to carry it out in the course. So if there is anyone in our audience who is interested in about children and family in contemporary Buddhism, I will be very happy to see you studying this subject. And finally, there is so-called tourism. I'm very happy to notice that in the past just 2 years, there have been several publications, several researches on the subject of Buddhist tourism. This is a very important and also very popular phenomenon in contemporary Buddhism. However, for some reason, we have not seen enough research into these issues. So this is one of the subjects maybe we can study further in the future, but it's something that I have not been able to do in my course while in our MA program. Now, what is contemporary Buddhism? And other things I want to mention is, when teaching this course, I often found my students often use the terms such as modern, modernist, contemporary, tradition, or even postmodern without knowing fully what those terms mean. Sometimes I will see students that use the term modern in one paper page and then move on to use the term contemporary in the next page. So it's all very confusing, and since I have background in sociology, I kind of find it very annoying when you use those terms without knowingly fully understanding what do they mean. And of course, sometimes dictionary is not too much help. So we look at this dictionary, their definition on contemporary and the term modern. They look similar. So no wonder our students will feel very confused. They all both mean that the present period. You can use either modern or contemporary, but then I will ask my students how they interpret this photo here that you can see on this screen. So how going to describe this photo? With this photo, some students will say, oh, this is modern. Some students will say, oh, this is tradition, because you see some of the women in this photo wearing the traditional dress. But then at the left corner, we see this woman. Oh my goodness, she's in high heel, isn't she? So how can a traditional woman called traditional women be wearing a high heel? It just doesn't make sense. So that is why I will ask students, perhaps you should define what you mean by modern and contemporary and tradition before you start to write your thesis. Right, back to this photo. This photo was actually taken in Taiwan during the 1930s. This is not a feminist group or even a women's group, but a social group, a social organization that is somehow very progressive in terms how they incorporate, including women in their position, some of the major positions in their group. So for those of you who can read Chinese, you can see on the right-hand side a list of names here where I have highlighted. Those are names of women. So women who could hold important positions in this very large organization during the 1930s. So in a way, it's not a feminist group, but it's a group that advocate equality advocate progressiveness in the society. And of some of the groups here, some of the women here of this group end up later on become important Buddhist leaders. For example, we see this name Zhang Yuezhu here. She later become a Buddhist nun in the Taiwan area, and then her temple still function today. And she is one of the earliest Buddhist nuns who advocate the idea of humanistic Buddhism, of social service, and her temples at one time host educational program for women. So we can see that there's a continuity of ideas, a continuity trying to make progressive ideas in the society. So it's not exactly tradition. Even for some of our students, the grandparents' generation is the so-called tradition generation, but here we see women who are progressive. So it's not exactly tradition, certainly not contemporary, but there is a little bit modern there. So that's the questions, that's the problem I face when talking to the students. I'll ask them, what do you mean by modern? And what do you mean by contemporary? And certainly we shouldn't use the term modernism too easily, too freely, without thinking what's the implication behind the term modernism. So we can see that some sociology or sociologists would define modernism simply as a way of thinking. This way of thinking influences the way we construct our reality. So later on, we will mention this whole idea of Buddhist modernism, how the followers or believers or advocates of Buddhist modernism construct the Buddhist culture we see today. And then if we look at the Journal of Contemporary Buddhism, on the front page, it says the current state of Buddhism. So certainly, contemporary will have to mean the current state. It doesn't matter when you are. You can be talking about 20th century, you can talking about 21st century, but it's just about current state. And the current state is a continuation. It's a continuation from earlier periods, from earlier ideas that would have already influenced how we perceive and how we construct our reality. So it's simply about current state, when and which period the author, the scholars trying to study. But it's also a cross-disciplinary subject. So on the front page of Journal of Contemporary Buddhism, it says that we will present works from philosophers, theologians, historians, and so on and so forth. They examine the historical, doctrinal, and political development that or construct Buddhism today. So, simply put, if my students want to mix up modern and contemporary in their thesis, I will ask them to define those terms more clearly. Perhaps when you say modern, you shouldn't mean modernist. Modern and modernist are two different things. They are modern, perhaps you mean the time period, and rather than ideas of modernism. So, thank you. So that is the basic from, and just because something happened in 2 centuries ago, doesn't mean that it has no influence on our current state of Buddhism, we have to remember it's a continuation of ideas. Maybe the pace of the change or exchange of our ideas is a little bit faster because of technology, but it's still being a continuation, it's still being influenced by earlier periods. So for example, we look at this wonderful paper by Justin Risker that called Original Buddhism and its discontent. In Taiwan, or perhaps throughout Buddhist Asia, we often see groups that call themselves Original Buddhism. Original Buddhism. So what does that mean by Original Buddhism? Usually those groups who claim to be original Buddhists, they are talking about Theravada. They are talking about Pali textual studies. So of course that place Pali text, the Pali language in an important position in the study of Buddhism. There is no argument by that. But if we look into history, we will notice perhaps this is not entirely all traditional ideas. It is mostly influenced by Orientalist scholarship at the turn of the 20th centuries. The Orientalist scholars, they place a lot importance into the study of languages, into the study of Pali texts. So it is sort of transform or even reevaluate the studies of so-called Hinayana Buddhism in the Chinese Buddhist discourse. In addition to Oriental's influence, we also see that at the turn of the 20th centuries, there is a perceived crisis in Buddhism throughout Asia. So Buddhists throughout Asia were trying to see how we reformed Buddhism, how we respond to the critics from other religions or from the Western imperialism, for example, from the Christian missionaries or from the colonials, Western colonials, which constantly put down Eastern cultures and Eastern religions. So even though China was never a colonized country, but those perceived crises also exist in the minds of Chinese Buddhism in the minds of Chinese Buddhists at the turn of the 20th century. And one of the many most important reformers is monk Taixu. Monk Taixu felt the need to defend Mahayana Buddhism from the critic that says Buddhism is superstitious, Buddhism is unscientific, and Buddhism is simply needs to be eliminated if China is to be progressed. So by 1928, monk Taixu think this is a good idea to send his disciples to Ceylon, now Sri Lanka, to study what he perceived, what he believed as the original Buddhism. So, and some of the scholars will see that this is a failed mission because all of these 5 monks who went to Sri Lanka did not stay in robe. They disrobe, and perhaps so some of the scholars would say it's not a successful mission. And because those monks did not return to China to reform Chinese monasticism. But the other Justin Risker actually argue that even though those monks who went to study in Ceylon disrobe in later period, they still continue to engage in Buddhist work, especially in the Buddhist translation. So many of the Theravada Buddhist texts were translated into Chinese by those monks who went to study in Ceylon during the 20th and 30th. So this is not entirely failed mission. Okay, so and we can see the influence continue today, either in the practice of the Buddhists or in the scholarship. There is a great emphasis on the Pali Buddhism, and in terms of the parties, we see some of the groups who call them original Buddhism. And of course, scholars being scholars always have to rethink and always have to investigate. So we have seen recently there is a scholarship asking, well, how Theravada is Theravada, whether this whole idea is this whole idea of original Buddhism or this whole idea of Pali Buddhism being closer to the Buddha's teaching is constructed by Orientalism or is actually constructed later on, or was it actually the case? Well, I'm not talking about the history, so I will leave that there. But it's fitting to say, since the turn of the 20th century, there is this obsession with the origin. Some of the scholars who coined this phenomena as the obsession with the origin, people trying to figure out what is the original word of the Buddha. And so that has been continuing even till this day. For those who are interested in this discussion, I would recommend to read a book that called Theravada is Theravada. Right, then people trying to understand, scholars trying to understand what's going on, what is the contemporary Buddhist phenomena, or common new term, new theories, trying to figure out what they see today. So by after some historical and ethnographic study of Buddhism in Sri Lanka, the scholar Gombrich come on this somehow controversial but term called Protestant Buddhism. Protestant Buddhism, they will see that after Buddhist reform movement in Sri Lanka at the turn of the 20th century, when they see today Buddhism in Sri Lanka should have exhibit characteristic of Protestant Buddhism. By Protestant Buddhism, they mean that there is a great emphasis in householders, such as in Christianity. There is no longer the Protestant Christianity place lesser importance on the role of the priests, but more on the lay followers. And so is Protestant Buddhism, or the Buddhism after Reform movement at the turn of the 20th century. There is a greater emphasis on the householders, especially on the middle class. And then there is a fundamentalist approach Buddhism. By that, they argue, because Buddhism prior to the 20th century does not place so much emphasis on the textual studies. That the reason being there wasn't much mass education in Buddhist Asia, and the literacy was the privilege of the monks, not to the average Buddhists. And then after the 20th century, mass education is a reality, and the reformers would place more emphasis on the textual studies. So for them, partisan Buddhism also means that this fundamentalist approach will place textual study a lot more in a higher position than practice, than the actual daily practice, devotional practice. And the Protestant Buddhism also carried the characteristics of claim that Buddhism is not a religion, but a philosophy or a way of life, a way of living. But most controversial is the scholars claim that Buddhists nowadays depend a lot on English language, on Christian model. So we can see throughout there's a lot of debates about how valid Buddhism, the concept Buddhism Buddhism is. So is everyone after the 20th century, after all those reform movements, speak English, come from middle class, so and being influenced by Christian ideas. This is one of the more contest is one of these very controversial issues in this subject, in this theory. But more recently is this idea of Buddhist modernism, probably not trying to replace, but more like give a better interpretation of the Buddhist culture we see today. And this term, Buddhist modernism, I believe was first coined by Robert Schaff in his paper that talking about meditation. Basically, he said that the emphasis on meditation, or even use the term experience, is not so much a Buddhist tradition, but probably come from a certain 20th century Asian reform movements, Buddhist reformers growing to emphasize the importance of meditation, to urge a return to meditation experience. So today we see many Buddhist organizations or Buddhist teachers would place meditation above other forms of practice, such as devotional chanting or what they perceive as superstitious. And then in the 2008, there is this book called The Making of Buddhist Modernism. This book very details the authors or the Buddhist leaders who try to reform or modernize Buddhism. So by Buddhist modernism, or what we should say, modernist Buddhism, sometimes we mean is westernized, demythologicalized. That means the ideas of gods or like supernatural powers become less important in Buddhist modernism, or rationalized. We see a lot of authors or scholars who try to argue that Buddhism is compatible with science. True or not true, true or false, this is a very popular idea. And by rationalize also means individualism. So we can see that in English Buddhist writings, especially in North America or in Western Europe, they will emphasize that Buddhism is an individualistic practice. You can practice Buddhism by yourself, even without a Sangha. And of course, that's very annoying or even like confused in the eyes of Asian Buddhists, where the community, the Sangha, is still important. But then there's this idea of romantic life. Primarily, it has to do with environmentalism or into this ecology. So, for example, the theory of deep ecology is argue that, well, environmentalist movement is not enough, it's not good enough, and ecological ideas is not deep enough. We perhaps need to go into consciousness, our inner self, to see how we are interrelated with the ecosystem. So we have this idea of deep ecology, which claims to have borrowed ideas from Buddhism. So the romanticized Buddhism that is being portrayed in some part of Western countries is that Buddhism is fit with, is very compatible with ecology, with environmentalism. And it's another characteristic of Buddhist modernism is protectionism. That means middle class, educated. And of course, we are more familiar with how in the modernist Buddhism being psychologicalized. For example, when we look at this idea of reincarnation, or the idea of 6 realms of rebirth, so it's so difficult to scientifically to prove that the cycle of rebirth is real. So therefore, we see some Buddhist writers will argue that, well, it's just a psychological metaphor. You can be in heaven in one moment or in hell in the next moment. It's all in your mind. That's one element of Buddhism being psychologicalized. Another element, of course, is this very popular idea of mindfulness. Today in mindfulness, we don't just talk about Buddhism, especially after COVID, after 2020, we see a huge increase in the mindfulness app or in the mindfulness online programs. People in lockdown might want to practice mindfulness meditation at home. And then we see that in mass media, some people even claim that with mindfulness meditation, it can reduce the anxiety of living in the lockdown. We see that, right? And some of them are not so related with Buddhism. Some of them is being promoted by Buddhist teachers. The most famous one is certainly Thich Nhat Hanh, the Vietnamese monk, whose work until recently is very popular and being carried out mostly in Western Europe and in North America. So there's this Buddhist element in Thich Nhat Hanh's mindfulness, and then other Buddhists will question, well, is mindfulness actually Buddhist? Because in Buddhism, we also emphasize the idea In addition to meditation, we also emphasize the idea Buddhists, we might question how Buddhist is mindfulness. Well, either way, we cannot deny that modernist Buddhism is very much psychologicalized. Either you want to promote the idea of mindfulness, or you want to use this psychologicalized metaphor to describe some of the Buddhist elements. So that's what I mean. Modernist, and this could be different from modern, the idea of modern and contemporary. And this is one thing I would tell my students, perhaps you should bear in mind when you use the term modernist or modern or contemporary, you have to know exactly what do you mean. Don't confuse them. Right, so today we see most of Buddhist scholarship writings, we see that contemporary Buddhism probably is Buddhist modernism. Well, this is just a misconception. The reason for that is because modernist Buddhists tend to be better educated. They can write and they teach and better than what we might call traditionalist Buddhists. But in fact, even though in Taiwan we have very large Buddhist groups that tend to be modernist Buddhism, there are still many, perhaps even more traditionalist Buddhists in Taiwan who don't really care about how to engage in social service, but they care more about their devotional religious practice, such as the chanting of Buddha's name, or perhaps trying to get married and to have good karma to be reborn in a heaven. So we should not mistake Buddhist modernism with contemporary Buddhism. Not all contemporary Buddhism is modernist Buddhism. There are still a lot more traditionalist Buddhists out there, but they don't tend to write. So in Buddhist discourse, we don't necessarily hear their voice. That's one thing we need to bear in mind. Well, then why do we want to study contemporary Buddhism? That's one of the questions I was often asked by the students. Students would tend to say that, well, textual studies is probably more important. I'm not denying textual study is not important, but there are reasons to study contemporary Buddhism. For example, this is, we want to study contemporary Buddhism because of practical purpose. May I say that one of the most urgent or important topic of our days is about environment, is about global warming, climate change. We all experience that today because we are going through a drought in Taiwan today. Right, so on the surface, we see that Buddhism is very eco-friendly. So most famous, we have this tree ordination here. Tree ordination somehow is popular in Southeast Asia, where a tree is being ordained into Sangha, and therefore, since the tree is ordained, you cannot cut down the tree. Otherwise, you commit bad karma, which you might send you to hell. So that's one of the environmental activism being famously promoted in Southeast Asia. Our Latino will promote the idea of living a simple life, as this report by the Guardians shows. Because you live in a simple life, you notice that all beings are interdependent, then Buddhism is basically very eco-friendly. Or like in Taiwan, one of the largest Buddhist group in Taiwan is Tzu Chi. It advocates the idea of recycling, and it even sort of promote or advertise how they use the recycled plastic bottles into making blankets. So they use this blanket made of recycled plastic and to use in the disaster relief. So this on the surface is very, Buddhism is very eco-friendly. And if you want to know, you should read this book, Dharma Gaya, was published in the 1990. And basically, it gives you a lot of ideas about ecology and Buddhism, how these two concepts interrelated. So on the surface, Buddhism is eco-friendly. Unfortunately, Buddhism also have these practice called animal release. Even though here I only use two examples from Chinese Buddhism, animal release is actually popular around many traditions of Buddhism. We can find that in Cambodia, Thailand, in Tibetan Buddhism as well, or even in North America, right? So it's very common among Buddhists everywhere. However, even though it has a long history in Buddhism, some scholars will argue that animal release is not actually a Buddhist practice because the earliest record we can find is not in Buddhist texts, but in a Chinese text called Lies, where this is a king's urgent to release his cow so that he can show a mercy to his people. Well, in any ways, the whole ideas and practice of animal release has been incorporated into Buddhism, and it has become so popular. But it's so popular. These are groups, Buddhist groups, that particularly promote this idea of animal release. And it argue that, for example, if you are sick, then, or if you have some unfulfilled wishes, then you can release some animals so that you can accumulate enough merit to help you to relieve you from your current sufferings. Then, of course, as we know today, because of the environmental crisis, it has been criticized by many groups. So we see this one is actually a report by National Geography. It actually criticized how a Buddhist tradition of animal release damage, creating harm into the environment. And this video on YouTube is actually made by the Taiwanese authority, and trying to persuade people not to practice animal release. Because if you set free, if you release animals, the alien species into the natural environment, it might actually endanger the native species. So this is one contentious issue often criticized by authorities in Taiwan and also by non-Buddhists. And of course, I also must say, in many Buddhist organizations also oppose the practice of animal release. For example, for Guangshan actually does not practice animal release because, well, you can tell how much harm it might cause to the environment, to the natural habitat. Right, so we see that from this angle, from this perspective, Buddhism may not be so much as eco-friendly. In fact, Buddhist practice might actually bring harm to ecology, to the ecosystem. Well, this is not one purpose noticed only by Buddhists or by some of the authorities. The scholar Douglas Wheeler, actually as early as 2006, he published this paper, and he actually said that, well, is Buddhist actually eco-friendly? No, not necessary. There's eco-critics among Buddhist philosophers who will argue that earlier Buddhist texts actually place more emphasis on the individual's liberation, on how to achieve nibbana, rather than how you might engage in the eco-friendly activism. But there are also others who argue that we should try to construct some ethics or practice that could be eco-friendly. For example, we know that there are many Buddhist organizations promote the ideas not to use plastic, not to use the single-use plastic, which would just simply cause too much damage to the environment. Another reason that we must and that we want to study contemporary Buddhism is we want to hear the marginalized, the minority. We want to hear their voice. We want to know how diverse the world is. How is that important? Well, if we want to, people will argue that if we want to practice compassion, you cannot exclude some of the members of Buddhist community. For example, women. There is this international Buddhist organization called Secdita. It's actually formed by Buddhist women from many different countries. One of this agenda is to promote the education for Buddhist women, promote the equal right for Buddhist women, and also to promote the for ordination, bhikkhuni ordination in countries where it does not exist. So the bhikkhuni organization's ordination is perceived as important is that without this full ordination, then monks can argue that women cannot be placed in the role of leadership. And then you have this idea that women are somehow less spiritually incapable, somehow spiritually lesser incapable than men. And then it's just an idea that, well, since women are spiritually incapable, less incapable, then we perhaps shouldn't give women the same education as men, then certainly women will be marginalized. Then, of course, then we have this, we want to extend the argument. We will look at homosexuality or transgender in Buddhism, how we might exclude the homosexuality, transgender women in Buddhist practice. If we exclude women or we exclude gender minority, then how compassionate is Buddhism, right? So we study contemporary Buddhism not just to try to include the women's right or the equality of all genders or all sexualities, but we also must look into doctrinal textual studies to find this doctrinal and textual support for gender equality. And also, we want to know the marginalized minority because we want to practice compassion. And we also know that not everyone's story, everyone's voice are being recorded into text. For example, how many of us will notice Buddhism in Russia? There is Buddhism in Russia, but it's usually so marginalized. We study it alongside Tibetan Buddhism or alongside Mongolian Buddhism. Until recent decade, we don't really see a lot English publication about Buddhism in Buryatia. So let's simply as if Buddhism in those countries, in Russia or in some not so central Buddhist discourse, do not exist. We forgot their presence. So if that's the case, how can we understand Buddhism fully? And also there's another practice reason, such as we see the photo here. This is a photo taken from the website of a group in Hong Kong that specifically help to cater for the people who are visually impaired, help them to practice Buddhism. Then we think about it in Buddhist settings, we still notice Buddhists with disabilities because our Buddhist environment somehow are not so friendly to Buddhists with disability. Or for example, how can a Buddhist with visual problem can practice in a project if he and she cannot see well, does not know to which direction shall worship the Buddha, to which direction he or she should stand during the puja, then well, how can Buddhism claim to be compassionate if those minority groups are being marginalized and being neglected? And there is not to mention racism in Buddhist parties, especially after 2020, after Black Lives Matters in America, we see there's a growing number of writings by Buddhist scholars in America that are focusing on the issue of racism. Though they're focusing on in America, then we can also look at in Asia how we are Buddhism how the Buddhist parties here might somehow exclude certain minority groups, certain race, or even the poor, the underprivileged, etc. Right, so this is the one reason we must study. We must try to know what's going on in the contemporary Buddhist practice. or in the contemporary Buddhist culture. Otherwise, we might unintentionally marginalize certain group. And then it would not be a very comprehensive Buddhist studies if we want to talk about academic perspective. And if you just focus on textual discourse, then the marginalized group will not be in the text. You will not have very comprehensive studies. Right, and of course nowadays we are in a globalized world. We are in globalized world. Everybody is somehow interconnected with each other. We see the three photos here on the screen. One is Sri Lankan Buddhism, Tibetan Buddhism, and one is Vietnamese Buddhism. Well, they all occurred in Taiwan. They all occurred in Taiwan. So the traditionalists divide that alongside the geography border may not be necessarily valid anymore. People will probably question, how about Theravada Buddhism in Taiwan? And what is Tibetan Buddhism like in Taiwan? We live in this globalized world. We cannot just bear our head in text. If we bear our head we only study text, then we forget there are other phenomena, there are other very interesting cultures that exist alongside us in the same space with us, but we just don't know them. And then that would be a shame, and then that would make our academic study of Buddhism somehow less comprehensive, somehow has a little bit shortcomings. Well, having said all that, I just have to point out that the studies of contemporary Buddhism is not simply writing down cases. Mostly I would see students, they want to study contemporary Buddhism or they want to write about contemporary Buddhism. They would just do case studies. Well, no wonder contemporary Buddhism is somehow being neglected in the studies or in the academic studies of Buddhism. Because writing down cases, what's the point? Buddhist organization can do that by themselves. More importantly, is perhaps you have to contextualize the phenomena to understand what's going on. And that requires cross-disciplinary skills, cross-disciplinary knowledge. So we have 3 books here. Now, the first book, Monks in Motion, it talks about these 3 Chinese monks in Southeast Asia during the earlier 20th centuries. Okay, it may not be contemporary enough. However, if you want to know what's going on with Buddhism in Southeast Asia, you also must know what happened in the earlier period. So in these studies, we required studies of historian skills, historian knowledge. And then the second book, Mapping Modern Mahayana, and actually study for Guangshan in different countries through the lens of globalization. So therefore, to write this book, you requires the skills and knowledge of not just anthropology, because the author spent time to conduct ethnographic studies, but you also need to have the knowledge of sociological theories, sociological skills of interpretation and analysis. And well, since my time is up, well, I will just go directly into Q&A. Do I have any questions here? Right, I don't see any questions. Either I don't see any questions or...
Professor?
Yes.
There are no questions, so we would like to invite you to please continue the discussion to enable us to have more information about the topic.
Right, okay. Since there's no questions, I'm forced to continue my talk, right? Let's look about this. Sorry, I forgot my PPT. I will go on. Let me get my PPT first. So, cross-disciplinary studies. We require here, we saw that there is skills we must do to understanding what's going on with contemporary Buddhism, perhaps a historian, sociological, or a mix of everything when you want to know about Buddhist tourism in Asia. This is also very new and but very fascinating topic. We all know Buddhist travels. I have seen like in Vietnamese Buddhist ceremonies in Taiwan being attended by Vietnamese travel from many countries, not just traveling from Vietnam, but also travel from Europe, America. They travel with their Dharma master, particularly not just for tourist reason, especially not for tourist reason, but they want to travel with for a religious reason. They want to travel with the Dharma masters. And why is that? So why is that? Couldn't you just spend the same amount of money and just enjoy, have a better holiday in some better beach resort? And why do you want to travel with your Dharma master to other countries to engage, to participate in the same religious ceremonies that you could have engaged in your home country? That's where doctrinal study comes in. Doctrinal studies or doctrinal interpretations will help to explain why Buddhists don't just want to travel for touristy reason, but also want to travel for religious reason. Really is important to study doctrinal. And if you don't study doctrinal, if you just study like case studies, then probably it will become so dry and you will not even understand what's going on with Buddhist tourism in general in our contemporary time. So therefore, we have said that the studies of contemporary Buddhism is something rather important, rather important and rather necessary to do a cross-disciplinary skills. Okay, I see one question. How would one research more in the Buddhist canon and minorities? Whether it to be the ethnic groups back in Indian time or transgender people, homosexuality. Wow, this is a very big question that we have here. Back in the Indian times, back into Indian Buddhism, the study of Indian Buddhism, and contemporary Buddhism, at the first glance, doesn't seem interrelated, doesn't seem to be related with each other. But we have seen people doing that, trying to do that. For example, you can do that from geography, from the climate, from the natural results during the Indian time, during the ancient, in the Indian, sorry, in ancient India. So without taking into the environmental elements into consideration, how can one fully understand what life is like for ancient Indian Sangha? How do we actually understand when the Buddha asked the monks and nuns to have summer retreat, to have rainy season retreat, right? So we need to understand that, to understand the natural environment, and somehow that requires skills of geography, skills to understand the environmental changes, to understand Indian Sangha, ancient Indian Sangha. And also here's a question of transgender and homosexuality. It's actually a very hot topic, and there are quite a lot of papers on these subjects, especially on homosexuality, because in 2019, in Taiwan actually legalized same-sex marriage. So in days proceed, leading to the legalization, we see there are Buddhist arguments, groups who are against or support same-sex marriage. So, for example, one of the most famous writer is, one of the first most famous Buddhist leaders is Nan Zhaohui. I'm trying to find the here. It's Nan Zhaohui. She supported same-sex marriage, and she argued the support for same-sex marriage from the perspective of dependent origination. She argued that since gender and sexuality does not form the core of Buddhist self, there is no reason to go against these whole ideas of same-sex marriage. That's one of the reasons that she argues about. Right, sorry, I cannot find the papers there. I was trying to find the paper. And the transgender study, in terms of number, is fewer. We have not seen enough studies in this area, probably because it is a new subject that has been ignored and neglected for a very long time. However, we see recently there are papers published in this area, and most of them will use the skills of ethnographic or sociological skill, and to interview and to do participant observation, or even in the area of psychology, because according to some studies, there is a higher suicide rate among the transgender Buddhists. So there are, as far as I know, there are scholars trying to attempt to use psychological skills to study this area in terms of transgender. All right, so does that answer your question? I don't know if it answers your question, but that's what I have so far. Okay, right, thank you. And no one have any further questions, I guess? Well, then I'm just trying to, so now I will use one of the thing. One of the syllabus I had taught in my class. And one of things, one my area of specialty of which is family studies of Buddhism. So in terms when it comes to study the term feminist, there is a lot of aversions against it because people think that is actually that it is somehow against men, somehow trying to challenge the Buddhist tradition. But we have to know that in the second wave of feminist movement, and in the second or third wave of feminist movement, there are many of them are actually Buddhists themselves. Right, so like Rita Gross, one of the earliest feminist Buddhist writer, she is a Buddhist, Kamalech Somo, and Bhikkhuni Dhamma Landa, they are all feminists, but they are both nuns, Buddhist nuns. So what we're trying to resolve is to have the equal rights for women, either in terms of education or in terms of access to Buddhist structure or access to ordination. And most recently, the range become wider. We have others like Hu Xiaolan, Bing Xie. They are both non-Buddhists. So Hu Xiaolan, she specializes in terms of Buddhism and homosexuality. If we want to see how Buddhist doctrinal discourse might be used to maybe relate to homosexuality, I would recommend you read her publications. And the Big Share, I have to call Professor Share them because they are transgender themselves. And then they use the skills of anthropology, a little bit sociology, and psychology to study the issue of transgender. And anyone who is interested in this topic should read their papers. And overseas Anne Glenn, but now she's moving on to the studies of racism in American Buddhism, and John Powell, who focusing a lot on the studies of Buddhism and masculinity. So we see that a lot of Buddhist feminist writers, they are not so much against Buddhism, but trying to be more inclusive, trying to include the minority voices in their discourse, and trying to practice what we believe to be compassion, and also this whole idea of interestness, that somehow everybody is interconnected with everybody else. So if you exclude one members of the Sangha, then everybody is affected, and the effect, the influence could be quite negative. So in the earlier studies, we have these questions, perhaps we should move from androcentric discourse, that the discourse that focusing only on men, such as this famous painting here. For some reason, God always has to be a old man. God somehow cannot be a young woman. It's kind of this is what we say androcentric. So the second wave of feminists, they will argue that we should move from androcentric to androgenic, which is that inclusive of both men and women. So we should, for example, retail growth is, let's say, we should develop this and this androgenic outlook in our studies. So when we study, we will look at all members of the community, not just the monk, not just the men, the male members. And of course, we will have this idea in terms of Buddhism. The biggest issue is, can you give the full ordination to women? So the feminists will argue that the Buddha has said, my Sangha is complete if my Sangha has full flow of community, full flow of members, which includes monks, male householders, female householders, and nuns. And therefore, there is no reason to exclude women from contemporary, from the full ordination. And somehow, if a woman does not have full ordination, the householders might think that women are less worthy to give dana to, less worthy to give offering to. And therefore, women will consequently will be placed in the list, will have lesser, fewer access to education or structural support. And for the feminists, it's kind of excludes too much. But then in other aspects, we will look at religious symbols or ritual systems. Perhaps in terms of that, Buddhism will do much better. Because in Buddhism meditation or in other pujas, both male and females can participate together. However, when we look at the religious symbols, feminists often question the idea of these 32 physical characteristics of the Buddha. So, feminists will actually, and not just feminists, monks as well, traditionally monks and Buddhist leaders will teach that the 32 characteristics of the Buddha actually indicate that the Buddha is a man. Therefore, women cannot attain the ultimate goal in Buddhism, that is the Buddhahood. That's the traditional interpretation. Until John Powell's book come along, he actually point out that among the 32 physical characteristics of Buddha include mention of the sexual organ being hidden. So we have to remember that it actually means that probably the Buddha is neither male nor female. Otherwise, it would not mention that the sexual organ is hidden. So that is somehow one characteristic being forgotten through Buddhist discourse or Buddhist study. And then this is important to have inclusive androgynous outlook when we study Buddhism. Otherwise, we might put that discrimination, gender discrimination, we might internalize it without knowingly or intentionally, we are hurting other people. So for example, when my student, I went to studies, went on a trip in Myanmar, we noticed this sign. I don't know if anyone noticed this. I actually took this photo from internet, but we actually noticed this sign during our trip to Myanmar. It actually says, ladies are forbidden. Since I think everyone in our group are women and Mahayana Buddhists, and we are very puzzled. And there's this uneasiness among us. And we can imagine if someone who is interested in Buddhism and want to know more about Buddhism, and he or she saw this sign, and how will that make that person feel? This kind of internalized discrimination does not just exist in Southeast Asia Buddhism, but also exists in East Asia Mahayana Buddhism, such as in Taiwan. We have in many Buddhist temples, they will tell you this taboo on menstruational blood, how you cannot go to worship the Buddha if you are menstruating. And that would suggest that women's body is somehow dirty, and the women's body somehow is less worthy, and therefore probably you should just be excluded from some of the Buddhist practice. Of course, there's some of the reasons Buddhist feminists want to agitate against. Buddhist feminists, especially during the third wave, want to be so inclusive that not just women but gender minorities can be included in the studies as well. Right, so I think my time is probably up, right? Right, if we don't have enough questions, we don't have questions here. Do we have any more questions? Right, so that's one subject, feminist study of Buddhism. And also I'm more interested, like I mentioned earlier, I have growing interest in what is called transnational Buddhism. For the simple reason that people move, people travel. Perhaps in the pre-modern time, by that I mean before the mid-20th century, people do not travel as long distance and or as frequent as we do today. And people do not communicate so easily as we do today. Therefore, we can easily divide our Buddhist tradition, our Buddhist belief and practice alongside geography boundary. But this is no longer the case. And we have to notice that because the advance of this communication technology, how we all become one, how the Theravada teachings, Tibetan teachings, may also influence our practice today. So this is one area I think we shall try to grow into notice in the future. All right, I believe my time is up. If there's no more questions, do you have questions here, Cherry?
Professor, there are no questions.
Right, so shall we end here? Oh,
there's another one.
Oh, it's from Venerable Pazan. Thank you. I'm not clear between the distinctions between ethno-cultural, religious, gender studies. Well, ethnography, cultural anthropology, sociology. Right, that's a good question. Or simply put, you can say that ethnographic study is a skill. It's a skill that incorporates anthropology and sociology skills, and especially emphasize in the practice of participant observation, meaning you perhaps spend time and effort to participate in the religion that you are mostly interested in. Therefore, for example, if you are interested in Tibetan Buddhism in Taiwan, then we actually spend time with Tibetan Buddhist group in Taiwan. Then that's ethnographic studies. And in terms of anthropology study or cultural anthropology studies, it probably take longer. We say that it takes longer and requires more immersive participation in your study. But sociology studies sometimes also incorporate theories, trying to understanding the phenomena, trying to understand the culture from macro perspective, to interpret, to analyze the culture, and to relate that into other areas or other culture phenomena. So when we talk about sociology, sometimes we don't talk about participant observation or talk about field work. We actually just talk about the theological discourse, trying to understand what's going on, trying to understand each context. So then this is a question that nobody has answer for. What's the difference between ethnocultural, religious, and gender study? Well, basically, I would say that they are all related with each other. If we want to study ethnoculture, or you want to study ethnic group, it's very difficult to eliminate the religious or gender elements from ethnic groups. So somehow they are all interrelated. They are not mutually exclusive. All right. I don't know if I answer your questions, but usually I teach that in my other course called Sociological Study of Buddhism, and it's 18 weeks of syllabus. So it's very difficult to study, to explain here. Right. Well, is my time up, Cherry? Well, if not.
Yes, Professor, it's almost time.
Almost time?
Yes, it's almost.
What do you mean almost time? 2 minutes?
We still have 2 minutes, but it's almost time. So thank you, Professor, for that wonderful and informative talk. I also thank the students who asked enthusiastic questions. But if you want to go deep into the study of contemporary Buddhism, I welcome you all to enroll in the Department of Buddhist Studies at Pogong University to find the answers you want. So today's online lecture, Studies of Contemporary Buddhism, is now complete. Thank you for your partaking. Please be reminded to fill out the feedback questionnaire for this lecture and leave your valuable comments. You can scan the QR code in your screen or click the website in the chat room for the questionnaire. The admission of the bachelor degree in Buddhist studies is still ongoing till August. If there is anyone you know who aspires to learn Buddhism, please visit the website for more information. The department also welcomes overseas students. Master degree program has English and Chinese track. For those who wishes to study Buddhism, please come and join us. For more details, please check out our website.
走在线上进入 Buddhist Life 线上讲座，下个场次将于下周六5月15日上午10点半至12点举行，由佛光大学佛教学系副教授陈义标老师主讲语言学习与佛教研究，期待与您线上再会。Thank you for participating today. I wish you peace and good health, and we will see you next week.